I feel like I've got the graveyard shift, so not only after lunch but after tea, and it's really, really gratifying to see so many of you still here. My name's Tom Bashford, so I am hoping to close out this day. I am lucky that I sit on both Cambridge Public Health and the Precision Health Initiative steering committees, and it's a real privilege to see so many pieces of work of which I've been aware across the university being presented today, but also a load of things of which I was not aware and will now be very interested in following up. I hope you agree. So our last session is tailored towards the future of what precision public health might mean, and you could argue that is a synthesis of the rest of the day that's gone so far, because I think we've seen lots of really compelling visions of the future. I'm really interested that we're going to start that session with Philippa Carter from the Faculty of History, who's actually going to give us a historical perspective, looking at how community-based healthcare has been done previously. We're then going to move on to Dr. Gemma Bale, who's one of the Associate Professors in the Department of Engineering, currently seconded to ARIA, one of the new government funding agencies. And she's going to be looking at how we are moving towards wearable metabolic brain imaging, particularly in dementia. And then finally, we're really privileged to have Leslie Lev from the University of Oregon, who'll be looking again at how we're using community engagement approaches to really drive how precision health can be equitable. And for me, that is a really major question at the heart of the precision health debate. Most of my work's in the global south, and we already see well-evolved health economies accelerating inequity. So I think as we move towards a precision health agenda, there's a moral angle that says that should be there to generate equity rather than to entrench inequality. So I think is that our greatest challenge. The final session is slightly unusual, that before we have the panel session, we're delighted to welcome Professor Frank Key from Queen's University Belfast, who's given us a keynote address on what his vision of precise public health is. So we've got a slightly elongated final session before our panel debate. So having introduced everybody at the start, I've done my timekeeping, and now I'm going to introduce my speakers to also do their timekeeping. There'll be timekeeping reminders as we go, and we'll try and finish on time so you can all get home. So, Philippa, if you're happy. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom, very much, and thank you, Andrew, for this invitation to speak to you today. I do appreciate that it may seem somewhat paradoxical to think about 700 years in the past when we're thinking about the future of precision healthcare, but I, for one, have found it extremely enriching to think with you all about how long durée histories of where we've come to, where we are at, when it comes to thinking about public health and precision health can inform where we're going. So I'm hoping to give you a case study which might help you to think through some of the issues relating to community-based and community-led healthcare, thinking in the future. And I'm focusing here on a small Belgian town called Giel, which is somewhat renowned in the history of medicine for the fact that it was doing community-based healthcare, particularly in focusing on mentally ill persons very long ago. And I'm then going to compare this with a short case study from a present-day service called Giel Autism Services, which actually takes its name from the original Belgian town. And my thinking here is to try to get you to when we're thinking about the biopsychosocial as a model, and we had this conversation after the just before lunch, this question of the weighting that we give to certain determinants of health and how we think in an integrated way and yet maintain precision in our approaches, and thinking about equity, how all of this fits together in practice. Okay, so a relatively recent study from 2020 on precision health and the role of the social and behavioural sciences and what they may have to lend to advancing the vision of precision health suggested that the goal of a unified approach is to match a full range of promotion, prevention, diagnostic and treatment interventions to fundamental and actionable determinants of health, not to just address symptoms, but to directly target genetic, biological, environmental and social and behavioural determinants of health in the future. And they pinpointed 3 ways in which perhaps taking a social perspective, and particularly being informed by the social sciences, might help in these goals, and they pinpointed developing interventions that continuously tune to each person's evolving needs over the life cycle, enhancing and accelerating links between research and practice, and studying mechanisms of change in real-world contexts. And I think my interest in this subject area has actually come from teaching a program and managing a program called Health, Medicine and Society, which is co-run between sociology, social anthropology, and the History and Philosophy of Science department, where I'm based, which actually teaches a number of pre-meds, but also people who will be going into health policy roles of various sorts. So trying to get them to think holistically without losing sight of the advances that have been made in genomics, in biotechnology, but thinking in terms of big picture, thinking in terms of prevention and intervention has been really helpful. So, a case study. Now, I'm a historian of health and medicine, and my period expertise actually begins really in the 14th century and goes right through to the 17th century, but I'm less of an expert when it comes to everything 1800 on. And I have to say that as a historian of early medicine, there are very few instances in which I can turn around and say, here is an example of best practice. Those of you who are familiar with some of the stereotypes about leeches, bloodletting, prescribing heavy metals to be taken internally, there are plenty of instances in which I can say with confidence that we have done better since, and that's fine. And it's actually a tricky balance to ask people to take these historical actors and their approaches to health on their own terms without inculcating a kind of anti-scientistic approach where I in no means wish to encourage anti-vax feelings, and yet nonetheless we are thinking about the historicity of scientific knowledge making, and that comes with certain caveats. Nonetheless, Giel, I think, is a really interesting case study in that it is founded in the 13th. Well, it's founded originally in the early Middle Ages, but it comes to be a unique model of community-based healthcare in which people bring those in their community who are not coping for whatever reason, the mentally ill or those with learning difficulties, and bring them to the shrine. And in the first instance, they came to this shrine because it was associated with a saint called Saint Dymphna, who was believed to be a patron saint, among other things, of persons with what we would now call learning disabilities of various kinds and mental illnesses. So the idea was that if you made a pilgrimage to St. Dymphna with your troubled family member or neighbour, then and prayed to St. Dymphna for healing, then they might receive that healing. Now, I'm very keen to not paint a rose-tinted image of the past when it comes to mental health care. This is actually what my own research is about, and there is clear evidence that people really struggle to cope. And one sign of the fact that they struggle to cope is the fact that many families actually ended up leaving their mentally ill or otherwise afflicted family members or neighbours in Giel. And there was a hospice that was built early on, and it's clear that the monastic order there took some role in overseeing provision for these people who had been left by their own communities, and placing them as boarders with locals. And by the end of the 15th century, so about 1450, this had concretized into a custom, a local custom, in which these people who came immediately became boarders and were placed with local families. Now, this actually has continued over the centuries in one form or another. At some point, the original church of St. Dymphna was no longer the locality, and the church was no longer the institution that was tasked with making these arrangements and providing extra support to these families. It became a civic arrangement, but nonetheless, the practice of boarding continued. In the first instance, it's quite likely that the way that this system worked in a pre-industrial society was that there was some payoff for the families too, because they got extra hands to work on the farm, to work the land and so on. And as the Industrial Revolution and afterwards happened, there are many ways in which the system would have changed. But nonetheless, by the 19th century, I mean, if you look up Geel online, you might find it described as an example of de-institutionalization. But this is somewhat misleading in the sense that there was never a institutionalization moment in Geel. Although there was a psychiatric institution built, nonetheless, this kind of decentralized, de-institutionalized model was always in place as far as we know. What changed was in the 18th and 19th centuries, elsewhere in Europe, institutionalization became seen as best practice, that the mentally ill were systematically put into institutions. But many researchers in the 19th century who came to Geel were struck by the happiness of the residents. Now, there has never actually been a long-term study of the health outcomes for these boarders, as they're called, boarders or lodgers, but nonetheless, they seem, from anecdotal reports, I mean, I would love to see one done. Apparently the practice has now shrunk quite considerably in size, but nonetheless, that they did report high levels of satisfaction and longevity, in that they seem to have become part of the community and stayed there. And those who still maintain the practice seem to take a lot of civic pride in the fact that they are taking in boarders, as the town has done for centuries. So this is one example of Luke Eknans, who's 51, and he has lived with his host and her husband for a number of years. And many of these boarders have diagnoses of psychosis, schizophrenia, and so on. And what's remarkable, and what has been noticed from the 19th century onwards, is that in many instances the symptoms of these people often become much less marked over the time of their stay in Geel. And this has been attributed to the fact of the placement in a family setting, which is nonetheless not the boarder's family. That means that the affect response is generally more neutral, and also a kind of norm setting within the town of Geel, in which a mental difference and behavioural difference is expected, simply because of this continuity. Okay, I am fast running out of time. I will only touch briefly on this Geel Autism Services, in that they take they are obviously tailored to help autistic young people and adults throughout the life course to have fulfilled lives. And this is one of the slogans on their website: if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. In its original foundation, this was organised and run by parents of autistic people, but it has grown since into a government-funded healthcare provider, very much person-centred, and trying to integrate people, or to empower autistic people to become part of their community and to contribute meaningfully in the ways that they want to. That's really central to their model. And I think that in thinking about the future for precision health, I think what the past can maybe tell us is, for one thing, being alert to reduction of various kinds, right? So as has been pointed out, the danger perhaps of looking at the genomic in isolation from other things is that we end up being somewhat over-determining in our sense of where we can intervene and what will make a difference. In fact, both in the Geel Autism Services and in the original case of Geel and in other similar projects, often the message has been less is more in terms of intervention, actually leaving it to the patient, or not the patient but the boarder, the individual, to feel part of a community and to be light touch if they don't need therapy or assistance, but having a network to provide it when they need it is really key. And of course, another reflection on both of these is that is funding. And I think this comes back to the point that was made about pragmatism earlier, that this kind of tailored response requires a lot of training of families, communities, and professional staff. And that when we think about precision health, we should certainly think about how we can do this in an equitable and pragmatic way, which doesn't sacrifice the base level of care and support provided. Okay, leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation today. It's great to be here and hear so many different perspectives on precision and public health. So my perspective is as a developer of medical technologies. I'm a physicist by background, and my lab now sits jointly between engineering and physics, but we collaborate a lot with people in Adam Brooks. And I'm really excited to sort of share with you our technology and how we're trying to embed it into dementia, both through research, but also thinking about long-term into the dementia care pathway. So I first want to introduce the technology that we develop. It's an optical technology that means that we can develop wearable brain imaging systems to measure brain function. So how does that work? So we use light, so red and infrared light, to shine into the brain in a completely non-invasive way. So if you imagine shining a torch through your fingers, you'll see some red light coming through the other side. That's the principle that we use to monitor the brain. We shine light in. You can see here a simulation of where the light would travel through a child's head. And you can see that we're sensitive to parts of the grey and the white matter, and we can detect some of the light that comes back out. What do we do with that light? Well, we can compare it with the known absorption properties of things inside the brain, particularly oxy and deoxyhemoglobin, so we can find out how oxygenated that area of the brain is. And that means that we can use it as a marker of function through neurovascular coupling. When the brain is more active, it demands a lot more oxygenated blood. So you can see here on this time trace that as a person is functionally stimulated in the blue block, we get this huge increase in oxygenated blood as it rushes to supply the energy demand of the brain. So we can use this hemodynamic response function, we call it, as a way of identifying how active the brain is. So I've been developing these kinds of tools for the last decade, but only recently have I set up the lab here in Cambridge. We're mostly focusing on how we can help in the dementia care pathway. So I'm sure that I don't need to tell this audience how big of a public health priority dementia is. We know that cases of dementia are increasing as our societies have an increasing aging population, and that problem is only going to scale on a global manner. And currently the way that we diagnose and monitor dementia is highly subjective and variable, but also really inaccessible for large parts of both the UK population and also the global population. So some of the most common neuroimaging tools that are used to identify dementia are inaccessible and expensive in the case of things like MRI or PET scans. They're difficult to use in a vulnerable population and require that a dementia patient would come into a hospital to receive the care. That means that it's not feasible for use in local settings. It's really, really hard to do longitudinal studies. So if you're lucky, you might get 1 or 2 MRI scans, but you're not going to get one every month or every week to see how your treatment is progressing. So, and it also means that the studies of the brain and how it's functioning are completely separated. So you'll either do a cognitive task in your home perhaps, or you'll have an MRI scan in a hospital. Those two things are completely separated. So trying to understand the brain and its normal function in an ecological setting is really, really challenging. So people have been looking into whether we can use wearable brain scanning to look into dementia, and we know that different forms of dementia have different vascular or metabolic pathways, so it seems kind of intuitive that there would be a relationship between how the brain is functioning, how it's responding in its hemodynamics and metabolism, and how and the level of dementia or the subtype of dementia the patient has. And there have been many studies using this technology over the years. We can see an increase in the last few years applying this technology to dementia. And there's been a relatively clear signal that hemodynamic response that I showed you at the start gets suppressed in Alzheimer's particularly. But what hasn't been shown is in early stages of dementia, so in mild cognitive impairment, there hasn't been a very clear link for how the metabolic and the hemodynamic response happens then. And I think a lot of that reason is because of some of the challenges in dementia in using this optical technique is that the brain has atrophy. So in Alzheimer's and some other forms of dementia, you can have atrophy where the brain literally shrinks away from the surface, which is a problem when we have an optical technology that is only able to penetrate the first couple of centimetres of the brain. So being able to account for that is really important. So we need to design our optical technologies to make sure that we're able to accurately monitor the brain and we're not just monitoring essentially empty space above it. So in our lab, we've been using a form of NIRS called high-density diffuse optical tomography. So this is using NIRS, but with many, many, many light sources and detectors. So we have lots and lots of channels all across the head. So we're partnered with a spin-out from my previous lab at UCL called Gower Labs, and they developed these caps, which you can see are incredibly wearable. They're essentially like putting a swimming cap on the head, and then we have these modular tiles, which are where all of the electronics is. So you can see these light sources, there's 3 on the outside, and 4 detectors in the middle. So that tile is about 2 centimetres across and can be placed anywhere on the head depending on the functional area of the brain you're looking at. And that gives us this sort of network of light sources and detectors spanning the whole of the area of the brain we're looking at. And then we can feed into our model an anatomical representation of the brain. So in this case, we've given a healthy brain atlas. But in the case of dementia, we can actually get the brain scans of the people who have dementia, so we know exactly where their brain is and how much light is reaching it. And that allows us not just to estimate how the whole head is responding, but specifically how the brain itself is responding to the cognitive tasks we're giving it. So my PhD student, Amelia Butters, who can't be here, has sort of pioneered using this technique in a population of people with dementia. She's done an incredible job of building a really large data set across the Cambridge and Peterborough NHS Foundation Trust. She's currently in her final year, so you can see her stats now. But we're looking at 4 different categories of people, either healthy elderly, 2 forms of dementia, so we're looking at Alzheimer's disease and Lewy body dementia, and then a group that's having prodromal symptoms of dementia and mild cognitive impairment group, likely to have Alzheimer's in later stages. So Amelia's been going to people's homes, which is one of the things that we're most excited about with this study, and getting them to do the cognitive tasks that they might normally do as they are being diagnosed with dementia. But we're doing this with NIRS monitoring on their brain. So we're able to start to link the cognitive and behavioural responses that they're getting with what's actually going on in the brain. On top of that, we're also collecting their MRI scan, which a lot of these subjects already have as part of their clinical pathways, and we're collecting all of the typical neuropsychological and clinical data so that we're able to really understand their diagnosis as best as possible. And then we're getting them to do a range of different tasks. I'm sure you're not surprised that there are quite a few memory tasks, but we also get them to do some tasks that we hope will be able to sort of start to pick apart both the type of dementia they have and the stage they have. So we're particularly interested in whether we can separate Lewy body dementia from Alzheimer's. So we've designed a visual stimulation task and a motor task because Lewy body dementia can have visual hallucinations and problems with motor impairment. So we're hoping that this will enable us to naturally pull apart those 2 sort of subtypes. So I'm going to show you some of the results from the visual stimulus paradigm. But before I do that, the slide that I'm most proud of in this deck is this one, because being able to take neuroimaging directly into the home has been incredible for our study. Oh wow, 2 minutes. It's enabled us to collect data much faster. So the lab that Amelia works in is led by John O'Brien, who's used to doing neuroimaging studies with MRI. We've been able to recruit about 5 times the pace that a normal MRI study would do. We've also been able to increase the participation of our studies. So we've been able to represent the sort of Cambridge and Peterborough area much more representatively than if the study was to take place at Addenbrooke's, for example. So Amelia's been driving to people in Suffolk, in Peterborough, all over the place, and able to take the equipment into people's homes, which means that they're much more relaxed, they're much more likely to say yes to studies. And you can see here that the setup is relatively straightforward, and she's always in and out within about 3 hours. So we've had really, really good uptake, and I'm really excited that our data is much more representative of the actual population. So, as I said, we're still collecting data at the moment, but I just wanted to show you this response. So what you're looking at here is the back of the head, the occipital lobe, and the response of a healthy control compared to somebody with Alzheimer's disease. And as I've not got any time, I think the thing I want you to pull away is just how much stronger the response is in the healthy control compared to that with Alzheimer's. And Amelia's already done some sort of preliminary studies on much larger sets of data, showing that we really can pull apart the differences between Alzheimer's disease and mild cognitive impairment, as well as that healthy control. So we're really excited to kind of dig into that wealth of data that she's collected. As I'm out of time, I won't go into how we're looking at metabolism as well, but we're basically working towards developing new optics that will allow us to not only look at the hemodynamic response, but also the metabolic response. And that, we hope, will be able to untangle the dementia subtypes in a more precise way. So I kind of wanted to finish on this slide where we're thinking both about the precision of our diagnoses, but also the public access angle. So how can we make these things more scalable? How do we make our research more representative of the population? How do we make it more inclusive? And by doing, we're constantly thinking about that within the lab. And I'd really love today that how strongly the systems approach has come out, and that when we're really thinking now in the lab that if we have a tool that is truly able to help in the diagnosis and the monitoring of dementia, how do we build that into the care pathway in the most scalable way? So I just want to thank my really, really diverse multidisciplinary team, our funders and collaborators, and looking forward to the panel.
Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you. Yep. I go backwards. I need to go backwards. Sorry, I don't think it started in the beginning. There we go. Thank you. Welcome. I'm Leslie Lev. I'm visiting here from the United States in the state of Oregon, which you may or may not know. I'm happy to be residing in a blue bubble set of the country right now. And happy to be visiting here. I'm going to talk, I took the charge of thinking about the future of public health to think more specifically about this idea of promoting equity by getting participant and community engagement as part of the research process. So as we've learned very insightfully this morning and this afternoon, I also should say I'm going to kind of use this platform to talk a little bit specifically about adolescent mental health. And as we heard this morning, that is in part because that is a crisis not only in the UK, but globally right now in terms of the prevalence rates for youth mental health. And what we know from that field, from that background is, and we heard from this morning, is that there are already lots of activities around kind of precision approaches, precision mental health with adolescent mental health. Some of those involve genetics, looking at genetic polymorphisms, polygenic scores. Some of those look at MRI techniques, such as the presentation we just heard just before me, using both structural differences in adolescents as well as when they're doing functional tasks, such as inhibitory control or cognitive control kinds of tasks. And some are using wearables. And those do include things where you're looking at things like heart rate variability, sleep patterns, but also things like location patterns. Some of our partners are doing work with phones where they're able to look at location patterns of where a youth is in their community and if they're at risk for depressive symptoms. For example, looking at how much time they're spending in home or in community settings with other people versus with peers and parents, things that we know are protective factors. So being able to look at sensors and wearables in ways where we're coding location and also coding emotion words through looking at their app use and pulling out not only emojis from those, but also the words and the content of the words to be able to use those as predictors of mental health in adolescents. So That said, even though there's some tremendous progress in this field, we're still seeing pretty small effect sizes in this space in adolescent mental health. We're lucky if we're seeing sort of 6 to 8% of variance accounted for. Usually it's much smaller than that, even with precision approaches. I think a lot of that reason is, as we've talked about this morning and this afternoon as well, social determinants of health may not be factored into those models as precisely as they could, or I would call them social predictors as opposed to determinants of health. But we also know that some of the more ecological contextual factors of the proximal environment, such as parenting and peers around adolescents, are particularly important and haven't been factored in and may be resulting in these smaller effect sizes. We also know that the complexity of what we're doing in our methodologies, our science, is sort of, it's progressing extremely rapidly in terms of the technologies for genomics as well as imaging, as we heard from the presentation right before mine. But we also have similar work to do on the phenotype, the outcome side, the mental health side. So thinking about things like comorbidity, whether we're focused on just symptoms or diagnostic criteria, and how to look at that from a more precise angle when we know that symptoms can be predictive and preventative of later outcomes. And then what I'll focus mostly on here is this bullet around we have a lack of kind of representation, both as us, who are the researchers engaged in this work, of the participants in our research studies, as well as hearing from the community about their leadership, their ideas about what we should be focusing on in the adolescent mental health or other outcome spaces. And of course, those all do kind of coalesce into ethical considerations, including trust or mistrust from our population that we're focused on in terms of their willingness to participate in this kind of research, or to have confidence in the data and the results and recommendations that we might be providing from a public health standpoint. So what I would propose here is that there are many solutions to that, and the one that I will focus on is thinking about ways we can be more inclusive and proactive in getting community input into our research. I'm going to use the term here, community-based participatory research. You may know that by other names, such as community-engaged research, or participant action research, or university community partnerships. I have a definition of CBPR, community-based participatory research, here, and I'll just highlight a few aspects of that. It does involve a partnership that equitably, and I think that word is important, involves community members, organizational representatives, and academic researchers in all aspects of the research process. And then the word all there is also critical. Enables the partners to contribute their expertise and shared responsibility and ownership, enhances the understanding of the phenomenon, integrates the knowledge gain with action to improve the health and well-being of community members through interventions and policy change. And so with that definition, what I will show you next is a kind of a continuum. That's a pretty broad and encompassing definition, and you might be thinking that's just not feasible to do within my program of research. But CBPR and participatory engagement approaches do fall on a continuum that I'll talk through for a few minutes on this slide. So this slide, essentially, if you start at the far side and go across, it's kind of lower levels of community engagement all the way to full shared responsibility and shared leadership. So on the outreach side, and if you just sort of focus on that top row there, outreach is when us as the researchers or folks leading the research are simply reaching out, getting some community input, and then that might shape our research questions, our procedures, or approaches. If you move to the consultation approach, then you have a little back and forth where we're doing outreach, we're getting some knowledge back from our community partners, and that's going to sort of shape the nature of the conversation of the research. Moving to involvement is a little bit more formal, and instead of this sort of me as the researcher getting input from the community or community providing input, there's a bidirectional conversation where you have more back and forth and iterations between the two parties. You might have a visually, formally recognized partnership that might be on your materials, where you say you're a partner with X agency or X group. But it's really not till you're on the collaboration column there that you might have shared funding sources. They might be sharing in the resources that contribute to the research. It's not only just this bi-directional conversation between the university or the researcher and the community that you're focusing on, but a lot more kind of iterations of that to shape and refine your research and approach. And then when you move all the way out to shared leaderships, that's where you truly do have a model where it is co-led and by the community partner and the research team. You have strong research partnerships. I'll give you one example of this from some of our work with parents or people who have substance use disorder and are either parenting or pregnant. And so in this model for shared leadership, for example, we have National Institutes of Health funding to conduct research with parents who have substance use disorder. And we have a lived experiences board, and they have sort of three main priorities there. One is that they have some of the funding from our funder to actually design and propose a research study, and then they hand it over to us as the researchers to collect the data and analyze the data, but they're the ones designing and coming up with the research questions and hypotheses, and then we're sort of on the end that collects the data and analyzes it. So that's one of the tasks that they have in this shared leadership responsibility. Another one is that they provide free consultation to others who are doing community-based research or research with people who have substance use disorder, and they serve as a free resource for anybody who has questions about their approach to give them input and feedback. And then the third is that they oversee a pilot program. So for folks who are wanting to do research in this space of young substance use or mental health with younger people or parents, they have they'll put out a funding call. They'll be in charge of oversight of reviewing the proposals for a fit with the community needs, and then delivering the funds to oversee those. So it's a little bit of, it's much more leadership than you would usually think of in terms of some of the other steps. It truly is where us as the research team have our own responsibilities in collecting data and overseeing some research questions, and they have parts of the funding to do that on their end as well. And then we bring those two perspectives together. So I'm going to give you just last slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about some example activities that we've been doing in the space again around youth mental health. And so one way to have this sort of more engaged CBPR approach is to have an advisory board or a community advisory board. So that could be comprised just of the population that you're focused on, for example, youth, and I've seen examples of that from the meeting thus far today. With the community advisory board, you might have the adolescents who have mental health challenges, but also parents or carers who are parents of an individual who has mental health challenges, or you might have the mental health service providers also serving on that board. But the key is that they're representing diverse perspectives and providing on varying levels of that continuum depending on what fits with your particular approach and project and funding stream, providing that bidirectional or leadership opportunity. So some of the things that we have used these structures for are things like just the basic nature of the assessment. Is it really going to capture, if we're focused on, for example, getting more precise in measuring adolescent depression, and we want to use an app that's going to be looking at their locations, for example, talking to the youth about that. Is that going to measure, is knowing what we are looking for, is that actually going to be accurate, or are they going to come up with reasons for why, well, actually they leave their siblings borrow their phone, and so what we're really going to be tracking is other family members, not just them. So you get insights into things that could cause error or measurement variance in your data that you might not realize without having that data. Also, the second one is the assessment accessible to the community, in this case again adolescents, so that kind of ties back to our consideration of ethics too. Even if we design what we think is going to be the most rigorous and precise, perfect assessment approach, but they're not going to use it because of for a range of reasons that they would provide, then that's ultimately not going to help us be more precise in our identification of mental health risk. They might also come up with ideas for what is missing or needs revision in terms of wording, kind of more minor modifications in our wording or our approach or our procedures that would increase precision. And then these last two bullets here, the first three were really on sort of the setup of the research design. The last two are more on the outcome, the products of it. So once you have those findings as the researchers, really taking those back to those boards, advisory boards and community boards, and sharing the input, the feedback with them before you're putting it out in your journal, to get kind of refinement in your framing of the story, your discussion of implications, your recommendations, to make sure that it's aligned and acceptable to the population that you are writing your research about. And then similarly, it can also help you identify potential barriers to wide community public health scale up, because that ultimately is our goal here too, not just to serve those in our individual study, but to have the more wide scale community scale up. Of course, I just want to end by just saying, of course, this process is time intensive. We do not always have the time to do this. For example, one of our projects did take place in 2020, and it related to health information for Hispanic communities around prevention of COVID, of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And we engaged in some of this activity, and the bottom line is we had to go into the field, because we did the risk-benefit analysis and realized even though we hadn't gotten through our whole process, people were dying and we needed to get them the information. And the longer version of that is that after a year later, we received additional funding and were able to do more rigorous community-based approaches. And in our first phase, we were serving, of the people we were serving, maybe 60% were from the community we were trying to serve, the Hispanic community. And in our second phase, when we had the more rigorous approaches, we were up to 88, 90% of our participants served were from that population. So it made a difference, and we had to balance getting into the field at the time of a public health crisis. I think I will conclude there. Thank you very much.
Leslie, thanks so much. Frank, you've got the enviable task of if you just synthesize the entire day into one keynote address, that'd be brilliant.
Well, I have Gordon Harold to thank for the invitation to come today, so thank you, Gordon. Both Gordon and I sit on a methods advisory group at DWP, and it strikes us that even in an ostensibly non-health government department like DWP, targeting of interventions is right at the forefront of what we're trying to do now, and parallel to precision medicine, precision public health perhaps. But what I'm sure frustrates me and perhaps some of you is that the enterprise is seldom scoped or defined with any rigour. Now, I'm neither an oracle nor sage nor clairvoyant, but I could see threads of what I'm about to say all through virtually every other speaker today. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Including Ian, but only in the sense I'm about to cause some visual distress, I think. So I was more than content to be given the title, How Can We Make Public Health More Precise? Because that forces us to think what we're setting out to do and perhaps where the navigable paths might lie. And I won't be presenting you with neat answers, rest assured, but I look forward to the questions and answers later on. So this is a broad view of the areas that I'll try to cover, though as Eric Morecambe might have said, not necessarily in the right order. But I'll eventually try to see that if indeed recent developments constitute a yellow brick road, where are the potholes that we must look out for? So I'm not going to rehearse these two papers that David Taylor Robinson and I published just before the pandemic. And in those papers we set out some notes of scepticism about what was being shorthanded PPH. But I suppose the field has advanced since then, and so today I'm trying to take a more nuanced view, a more balanced view. But shortly after their publication, Nature and many other journals started publishing editorials on precision public health. And I think that the sentiment that they generated, illustrated by the quotation here, was spurred by post-pandemic virologists and geneticists who were exploiting microbial sequence data advocating for more sophisticated health protection surveillance, and when antivirals were in limited supply, targeting those to those genetically susceptible. And hence coming up with the phrase marrying the whiz-bang stuff from the geneticists with old school public health. And when David was contacted for a quotation by the editorial here, he questioned whether the precision medicine paradigm was right for public health, and here was whether it was a right paradigm for us to improve the health of populations. Now, my heart and soul is with David, I would have to say, but I'm going to try to see where the balance is to be struck, and perhaps where the common ground is to be found for people who read Nature with people like us who read public health journals. So, two terms or two ideas are often conflated. Precision public health is a term, and precision prevention has become a term. And it's possible that they are being conflated. So in this Office for Health Economics report just this year, the claim is made that a precision medicine paradigm is readily translated to accommodate primary, secondary and tertiary prevention, though the only primary prevention example given here was whole genome sequencing for neonates, while genetics was also the apparent backbone of what they were proposing for early diagnosis and secondary prevention. But the only other example in the paper of tailoring for more precise prevention, personalised prevention, was through digital interventions. So the preliminary question I'm posing is whether precision prevention and precision public health are synonymous, or whether we can build conceptual and practical bridges between the two. And I might ask, is the OHE paper at odds with current policy? So in 2019, this was what was stated as current policy. It was explicitly stated that more personalised predictive prevention will transform public health. So there's the two terms in one sentence. And it claims that big data and digital tools will better identify risks and, to quote, help the behaviours of those most in need before they become patients. So they wanted digital to be the backbone of this new approach. Now, someone called Matt Hancock wrote this document here, but I have to say that actually the current policy of the current government is very much aligned to what was in that 2019 policy document. And they talk about personalised prevention planning and empowering people to take control of their own health, and the mission being to use digital technologies to deliver personalised prevention at scale, aiming to more effectively communicate personalised risks and the benefits of prevention to individuals. So very much aligned to what the 2019 policy said. And I'm going to channel David Taylor Robinson again, because this, just last year, the Faculty of Public Health produced a very interesting document on what it was we were meant to be doing as public health scientists and public health practitioners. And it's prefaced, by the way, by the abridged Winslow quotation that we have all used in teaching our medical students and postgrads. And the author is a legal scholar from Bristol. And it's quite a fulsome report, but basically he talked about the 7 pillars of public health as a political tool, as government business, as social infrastructure, as a professional enterprise, as the blind balance, this is very important, the blind balance of benefit and harm, as a communitarian concern, and as the population's health itself. But let's return to Winslow's full quotation just for a moment. I'll read out the quotation. It concludes, as well as the sanitary efforts of society and the organisation of health services for the early diagnosis and prevention, the education of the individual in the principles of personal hygiene, now let's take hygiene in a broad sense here, coupled with the design of social machinery to ensure that every individual has the standard of living to ensure good health. So even in Winslow, which is the closest thing to 20th century scripture that public health practitioners use, even in Winslow the individual is evident, But in that broader definition from the faculty document in 2023, I think there was the hint of the first philosophical problem for predictive prevention when we consider what the blind balance of benefit-harm actually might mean. So that's where I'm going to start here. I think maybe I've raced to this. So the philosophical problem that I just want to foreground first of all makes us think about whether the paradigm is right or wrong. We're going to observe someone when we give a treatment and they get cured. So it's observable. But who benefits prevention is not the counterfactual that we actually observe. We'll never observe the condition that has been prevented through a public health intervention, even if we observe a decline in incidence. So there's a bit of a philosophical conundrum there. So the statisticians in the audience have articulated this problem in a slightly different way. And they advise us to try to understand risk prediction in a couple of ways and accommodate two aspects of risk prediction. One, the stochastic or aleatory element, which is blind chance, if I use that term, and on the other, the epistemic component reflected in, for example, the parameters that we derive for Q-risk or SCORE2 risk prediction equations, which aren't individual parameters, they're population parameters. And several people, like Deckers here and Stern, have tirelessly reminded us that individuals don't have an identifiable unique risk. And when we're trying to improve the sorts of prediction models we use in cardiovascular medicine, for example, because that's an area that I've worked in, our objective function is usually some sort of accuracy metric, some form of population-based accuracy metric. But are these the accuracy, or are these the metrics, rather, the most important determinants of how effective a risk score will be? And I'll return to that in a moment. But it hasn't stopped today's AI experts and computer scientists claiming, well, first of all, they're disregarding the philosophical musings for a start, but in Nature Medicine last year, some of the computer scientists were coming up with new AI methods, one called conformal prediction, which they claimed very strongly in these papers that they could narrow the uncertainty around an individual's risk estimate. Now, I'm not going to debate with computer scientists in the audience about the merits and the disadvantages of conformal prediction, because I'm not the person to do that. But the grandfather of this field, Judea Pearl, in his article here, frankly acknowledged the philosophical problem and, using his mathematics, nevertheless said that it's possible to put bounds on an individual chance of benefit from an intervention using both observational and trial data. But it's another question entirely about whether knowing those bounds, whether if I know the bounds or the patient knows the bounds, when we're trying to communicate this risk information, whether the patient will act in any different way. That's another question entirely. But my problem with conformal prediction, at least in this paper, it's not just philosophical. It also lies in the fact that the big data that we're all increasingly going to rely on, they're contingent data, and by that I mean that my observable health trajectory, the natural history of the conditions that I might suffer over my remaining lifespan, will emerge from the interactions that I have with several clinicians or public health programs, or from the medications that the clinicians have given me and prescribed for me over a period of time. So even if we do resort to some form of reinforcement learning methods, you can still ask the transportability questions. How would my observable illness trajectories evolve if I was in a different healthcare ecosystem? I'm going to park the philosophy bit. I thought it was worthwhile getting that point off my chest, first of all, and really come to the data problem itself. And it's not just an issue of the volume of data, but rather the types of data that we're going to need for more precise public health. Up until now, for example, in cardiovascular risk prediction, we use basic things like age, gender, smoking, BMI, cholesterol, etc. But over the last few decades now, there's been a huge effort invested in creating polygenic risk scores for cardiovascular disease. And unfortunately, by the metrics of discrimination and reclassification, these are not really very clinically useful. But of course, the omics data only represents a small part of what will characterize us as individuals in the future when we have wearables, like we heard, and biosensors, and also our lifestyle behaviours and interactions with the internet and the Internet of Things, and our own big data footprint, as we heard this morning. So there's certainly scope for our doctors to have a much more finely grained picture of us and of the population. I just moved that on. So in the future, cohorts like American Life in Real Time want to be far more reaching in the sort of data, including data on the social determinants that will be collected, including data on the physical and social environment that we inhabit, digital questionnaires, digital phenotyping from wearables, with a view to better characterising our life course exposures and the intertwined relationships between those exposures and a range of health outcomes. But I'm reminded of what Hugh Tunstall-Peto used to say a lot about the score equations originally, and Q-risk, compared to the one that he devised for Scotland, which was called the assigned score, which did have a measure of social deprivation within the score. He was disappointed that actually including those social deprivation measures, a limited number, only modestly improved the performance of the risk prediction. But he did say in his paper that it was the only one that did shed light on the equity issue of their use. So is the issue for us that we need to collect much, much more social determinants data? Well, there's a growing literature, not just on polygenic risk scores, but polysocial risk scores. And the Harvard group here looked at a polyrisk score to enhance the prediction of later life cognition, with the hope of using that as part of a predictive prevention strategy. And unfortunately, even with the addition of more than a dozen social variables on top of the ones that they already had, again, very modest improvement in discrimination and calibration. So their conclusion was that this wasn't ready for prime time, even with more and more social determinants data. But rather than throw the baby out with the bathwater, the editorials that have been written on this research theme, like this one here, say that really what those rather disappointing results should imply for us is that we should look far more carefully at working out the social mechanisms, just as the people discovering the GWAS signals then turned to the functional biologists and said, we need to think about mechanisms. So that's what the editors are saying. Let's make it our research priority to think about the social mechanisms, and I think that is a viable way forward. But if there is a data problem for predictive prevention, are we still like the drunk looking for his car keys under the lamppost? And it brings to mind what Osler said when he said it is much more important to know what sort of patient has a disease than what sort of disease a patient has. And so, are there aspects of the person that we're missing in this big picture for predictive prevention, like their perceptions of risks and benefits themselves, or the goals they want to satisfy for their remaining lifespan? And the importance of taking perceptions and preference into account was illustrated in this paper by Taxler et al., where they, after systematically reviewing the literature, they compared two men, one with diabetes and one who didn't have diabetes, but otherwise their other risk factors were really quite similar. And on the y-axis, they've charted out the gain in life expectancy that could be expected for a 62-year-old man if they addressed these particular risk factors. So it turns out that lowering cholesterol and blood pressure here might be more important for Bill than for Adam in terms of gain in life expectancy, while losing weight would gain more life expectancy for Adam. So the point I'm making here is that these insights about preferences and the focus of the person in front of us may well overshadow the magnitude of the effects of the biomarkers and the other risk factors that we're studying in algorithms like SCORE. So it's reasonable to ask, I think, whether we're measuring actually what counts. Do we know what is the most important goal for the individual in front of us? Whether she understands what we're offering could make a difference. And that's why there's been more calls for what people have called P5 medicine, to be predictive, personalised, preventive, participatory and psychological. And without such a model, I think we might be focusing on the wrong thing and crash the car. But I'll return now to my outline for certain assumptions that have already been made by me, which I wish to return to here. So, data. Now the method of looking at the data. Let's consider for a moment whether we know the best way to undertake the predictive analytics from a statistical point of view in prevention and public health. We're all leaning into AI and machine learning. And sorry, that's itself there. And when I did my public health training a long time ago, virtually none of the machine learning methods here in this review probably were much written about then, if they'd even been invented. So this review looks at a range of ML and AI methods that are now being used in prevention. And clearly there's 20 different options to choose from. You need a different approach for binary and continuous outcomes versus time to event outcomes. And each of the 20 or so methods here deals slightly differently in how they handle covariates for confounding variables at baseline. But of course, if you're dealing with longitudinal data, there's another 10 methods on this page. But the point I'm making here, and I want to be frank, is that how many of us really know what is best practice in this area today? I certainly don't in the modern big data era. And I'm sure there may be some of you in the room who will answer the technical questions for me. And I want to try a simpler approach first of all, simpler in one sense, but only to highlight the different types of epistemic uncertainty that predictive prevention and precision public health has to grapple with, but I don't think AI has got its arms around yet. And so the different types of epistemic uncertainty, you have the uncertainty around the probabilities of benefit, which come from trials and observational data. Then there's the ambiguity arising from conflicting evidence or lack of information, and then the complexity issue itself. And not all of these uncertainties will be handled robustly, I think, by AI, but I think predictive prevention will have to get traction on them eventually. And I want to illustrate that point really by very briefly multimorbidity, something that Chris Whitty did in this article here. And one of the drawbacks of the current predictive algorithms that we use is they're focused on one outcome. Nora's outcome might be a cancer, Nick's outcome might be diabetes, but seldom do we have a risk equation for someone with multimorbidity. And that's the point that Chris Whitty and his authors were also making in this paper. And it reminds us that, whenever you're dealing with multimorbidity in an individual, there may be diseases that co-occur because there's shared determinants, shared causes, but they may also be co-occurring for random chance reasons because they're prevalent in the community. But the thing that's left out in this model that Whitty was proposing here is symptoms, and that was mentioned by a previous speaker. The things that William Osler highlighted that are important for personomics to inform predictive prevention. And I'm grateful to these Canadian academics because they were highlighting the fact that, and I think this was said by a previous speaker, some similar symptoms may have more than one cause, more than one condition, or be byproducts of some of the treatments, making it harder for us to sort out what's causing what and what's ultimately the root cause of the distal outcome, like functional status or quality of life or burden, symptom burden, that we're trying to predict. So even if you thought you could unravel the linkages, I think these are some inconvenient truths for prediction. And the big data that we have is very incomplete. It doesn't have symptoms usually in the electronic healthcare record, and a lot of medication data is absent. I'm going to speed up a little bit. So if the big data era is not going to solve it for us, people have said, well, let's look at the small data paradigm, and we've heard that already from the people advocating for much more intensive individual longitudinal data from wearables, and I think that is certainly something that will come into the forefront and into the light. And it seems particularly relevant and tractable for those that are promoting digital interventions at scale, because that's what those two policy documents were advocating. So I'm not surprised that there have been calls for a greater emphasis on N of 1 studies, including from Nick's colleague Martin White and the psychologists, who have appreciated that many of the behaviour change theories that we've used for designing interventions, they don't tend to work quite as well as we initially would like them, or had hoped that they would. And they don't take account of the fact that during an intervention journey, a behaviour change journey, people change their mindsets, as they've called it in this article. And then how do we actually analyse the N of 1 experiments? Well, it's difficult. Susan Murphy, one of the, I think, strongest statisticians working in the N of 1 field from Harvard, comes with that conclusion. It's complicated. It's not easy to do. So I think that the statisticians that have worked with us for so long, they're going to have to go on a paradigm shifting journey. Unless, of course, as you have done in Cambridge, you get into bed with the engineers, which is, of course, not a bad thing, because one other perspective of N of 1 interventions and N of 1 trials is to use a control systems engineering approach to analyse the data, whereby through systems of differential equations, the approach, it is claimed, is capable of handling the iterating feedback loops between psychological predictors and the evolving intervention components that take account of past learning, ultimately predict the behavioural outcomes. Now, I don't think they're mainstream, these control systems engineering approaches yet in behavioural medicine, but their time may well come. But Susan Murphy called the approach complicated, whereas Reznikov, and this paper was published over 15 years ago, said that it wasn't complicated, it was complex. And he used the complex systems paradigm to think about the implications of understanding behaviour change interventions, because he said behaviour is highly non-linear. It's sensitive to initial conditions. There's path dependence, tipping points, and epiphanies. And we've all known people who just decided to lose weight or stop smoking, and they did it. You know, maybe that's rare, some sort of epiphany, obviously. But he uses in this article the analogy or the metaphor of a lottery ball to illustrate the complexity that the behavioural scientists may have expected knowledge, attitudes and intentions to come out of the tombola in that order, but because it's a complex system, they may not exactly come out in that order, particularly if there's a major life event, like the death of a spouse or a divorce or something. So I think that the analysis of these individual level interventions using digital tools needs a lot more thought. It's going to be one of the potholes in the role. And he was getting at context in a way when he said like an epiphany of a death of a spouse. He was getting at context. And I think Jeffrey Rose's name is forever associated with the plea for population scientists to move beyond the causes of cases, to search for instead for the causes of incidents and the causes of causes. He made the point that the normal distribution describes the distribution of many, many risk factors, biological and other, in our populations. Now, bear with me. because I want to bring in a bit of history. Francis Galton invented the quincunx over 100 years before Geoffrey Rose to illustrate how normal distributions could be generated from apparently random processes. But in this one respect, in this quotation of Galton, I think he was guilty of placing too much emphasis on the individual elements, the balls falling through the device, cascading through the quincunx, rather than the system generating the distribution itself. And I'm using the quotation as a metaphor for today's emphasis on personal characteristics of individuals, whether they be biological or genetic, that have given a rise, partially given the impetus to personalised prevention. But 100 years after Galton's invention, physicists were able to build several different quincunx models, one designed to generate the normal, one designed to generate the log normal distribution, and other distributions. And as Nancy Krieger said, as their devices clearly showed what structures the distribution is not the innate qualities of the elements or the balls themselves, but the features of the funnel and the pins, both their shape and their placement. Together, these are the structural features that determine who can pass through the pins, and for those that do, their possible pathways. Such an understanding of structured chances, she went on to say, rejects explanations of population differences premised solely on determinism, but forces us to consider the humanly engineered social systems, causes of causes, that give rise to the stratification of disease risk. So you can go to the simulator afterwards to illustrate what she's saying here. But actually, she puts it more eloquently, I think, when she says that our unique responsibility is to uncover the population level forces not visible at the individual level, which structures the distribution. And I think currently we have many statisticians from public health backgrounds that have strong elements of Geoffrey Rose in more modern papers, like those from Juan Merlo and others who have proselytized the adoption of a context-dependent understanding of individual-level heterogeneity. And Merlo asks us to indulge in a bit of a thought experiment about two BMI distributions that could be based on a social variable like education or employment status, some other characteristic, portrayed by two lines, red and blue here. And in each of the two scenarios, the average difference here is the same. The average difference between the strata is the same. But when the interclass correlation coefficient is small, we're urged to look instead for the general contextual effects that define the entire distribution and intervene on those, channeling, I surmise, Geoffrey Rose and Michael Marmot to look for the social determinants. So he went on to say further that in the future, epidemiology will not become the prisoner of the proximate if we adopt this multi-level approach to individual-level heterogeneity at different levels of analysis. In this way, group effects are more properly appraised through quantification of the share of individual heterogeneity that exists at the group level. And I, when I read this, can't help but thinking of Nancy Krieger's appraisal of the quincunx. But Merlo actually goes on to say that the idea converges with the idea of precision medicine and public health. But a radical conceptual difference exists, he says. Rather than only considering individual biomedical susceptibilities or dislocating those individuals from their context, a multi-level analysis tries to identify the components of individual heterogeneity that are context dependent and across the life course. So my attempt to reconcile, to find the common ground now, is to think about what the objective function is for our predictive analytics. Could we devise a different objective function to serve both individuals and populations? And let me give you just two very quick recent examples. My first example takes the idea of changing the objective function. When we're not using the usual model accuracy metrics of accuracy, mean squared error, error under the curve, calibration. Instead, the objective functions that they chose, in the paper I'm about to show you, included preventive potential, practitioner capacity, equity, and local logistics. So what these researchers, led by Dr. Allen and colleagues, wanted to do was to distribute drug overdose prevention interventions in Rhode Island to their maximum effect. And what they had to do initially was to map all the overdose deaths in Rhode Island, right down to census block group area, street level data. And they had about 200 socio-demographic predictors to do that. So very fine-grained data to map the overdose deaths. And using both a Bayesian Gaussian process and a random forest machine learning prediction model, they sought to predict the neighbourhoods across the Rhode Island state that, if prioritised, could prevent the greatest proportion of overdose deaths statewide. As such, their primary performance metric was the proportion of all deaths statewide that occurred in the neighbourhoods, or CBGs, census block groups, that were selected by the model for targeting. And the outcome variable then was overdose deaths per CBG, and the main set of predictors, as I said, was 200 socio-demographic predictors. But they did put constraints on the objective function, as I said before: practitioner capacity, preventive potential, health equity across the state, and jurisdictional practicalities. And as I say, the outcome variable was the proportion of deaths prevented. And very quickly, right at the right-hand side of the table, they were able, by allowing the machine learning algorithm to select the CBGs that should be targeted, given that their budget, I should have said, given that their budget was only going to be sufficient for 20% of census block groups. So they were only going to be able to target 20%. That was the budget that was available to them. But by incorporating these constraints to the objective function, they were able to prevent, if they distributed the prevention resources, 1.75 times more preventable deaths than if resources were just uniformly dispersed across the state. And of course, their algorithm could incorporate equity considerations when they compared rich or urban versus rural CBGs, rich versus poorer CBGs. And the practitioner then, at least, can see the trade-offs between total deaths prevented and the type of population being targeted. And it's important to say that the two algorithms that they tested out here don't produce identical results. They're not identical results. And I haven't got time to dwell on this, but I think the other elephant in the room is explainable AI. And if it is going to play a foundational role in precision public health, we're going to need to understand what is explainable AI. But I've really only used that example to illustrate how precision public health can introduce different constraints on the objective function. But of course, as was mentioned earlier, there was a call for precision delivery and precision implementation, and even before the Allen paper, there had been calls for more precision approaches to implementation. But very, very quickly, the second and very nearly finished the talk example. The example from Rhode Island, we were talking about deaths, and we had a constrained budget. But what if the outcome that we were trying to predict wasn't deaths, but the outcomes that were valued by the patients, patients, for example, with poor mental health? So what these researchers did was to simulate implementation of a multi-component intervention for mental health that involved screening, using screening tools, and then a treatment component. And they made certain assumptions about the distribution of poor mental health scores in the community. But how would they judge the success if they were going to implement screening and treatment? Well, they had several options for choosing a success metric if they were going to roll this program out. It could be overall population impact, defined by effectiveness times reach. Another metric could be that the program was successful when the maximum proportion achieved the minimum clinically important gain in mental health symptom score, or a final objective could be to minimize the burden on the most severely affected kids. So there's 3 different options. Let's be more precise about the outcome variable this time. And so what they found was, in their simulations that if the overall population impact was the success goal, then hardly any of subgroup B, I should have said that there were two subgroups, rich and poor, doing well and doing poorly. So if overall impact was the success goal, then hardly any of the subgroup B would get any of the budget. There was a fixed budget. On the other hand, if maximising the number of kids who achieved the minimum clinically important gain in symptom score, if that was the goal, then you would distribute your budget slightly differently, more evenly spaced. But if the goal was to make the very worst off kids better, that implied a different budget split. So the point I'm making here is that while the previous example illustrated how machine learning could help us allocate the budget with more acuity in pursuance of equity to take account of social risk factors, this example demonstrates that we need to be more precise about choosing our outcome variable before we make those equity judgments, perhaps. And that brings to mind what Nancy Krieger said that I mentioned a moment ago. So I like to think of precision public health needing a range of recipes and actions, and as Nancy Krieger advocated, uncover and then address the population level forces that are not visible at the individual level. So I do think that there's going to be a lot of axe sharpening to do and figuring out what the best question is to ask. I think Sandro Galea was the spiritual lead of this paper here when he was saying we need to do both. Be more precise but work upstream as well. My very last slide, I just wanted to give you an absolutely ludicrous example of emphasising the need, as David Taylor Robinson was said, to be cautious about a slippery slope. So David wouldn't have wanted his baby in the bathwater at all, I don't think. I've just tried to take a more nuanced view. So anyway, these physiologists writing in Nature during the summer said that we have to understand the biological mechanism of heat-induced stress and various environmental impacts on our physiology before we devise public health programs to mitigate the climate crisis. So I was a physiologist at one time, but I just think this is completely risible. So I'll let Homer give my response to this, in fact, slightly less, more reverently here. That's what I think. So there is a slippery slope, but I think there is some common ground that eventually, well, it will not be me in the future generation, but it will make public health more interesting. Thank you.